So by now you should have finished up writing your midterm essays, and these have to do with the period up to the Suez Crisis of 1956. So I would like to work today on the idea of discussing the period between 1957 and 1963, the period that leads up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you could say we go from Suez to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1957 to 1963. Perhaps we'll finish up with that today. Maybe it'll take us an extra meeting in order to an extra lecture in order to fully discuss that. So let's see. Let's begin. Let's begin in discussing the fallout from the Suez events. I guess those are probably the most important events, the most important benchmark, 1956, that we've had in this course so far. And there's a kind of common way of looking at it, kind of thing that Fink might suggest, that the Cold War up to that time had been, how to put it, set in European affairs, concentrated on European affairs, and that after that point, a certain stalemate had developed in Europe. It looked as if the United States would not intervene in questions in the Eastern Bloc, that's to say with Poland and with Hungary in 1956, and the United States similarly would not be able to act independently, or I should say Western allies, Great Britain and France, would not be able to act independently of the United States. Moreover, that they'd have to be entirely dependent on the United States, almost to the same degree, one might say, at least according to this generalization, as the Hungarians and the Poles were dependent on the Soviet Union. At any rate, that's one scheme of generalization about it. A number of accounts, especially the older accounts, put it that way. They make the argument that the Cold War is in concrete in Europe, and from this point on, the center of action leaves Europe, and it becomes essentially devoted to the Third World. And the Cold War, the rest of the Cold War is a story of the Third World, not a story of Europe. This isn't right, of course. So we're going to be referring to Europe in the 1970s with regard to the Portuguese Revolution, Eurocommunism, and all sorts of developments in Europe that are important for us to take into consideration. And naturally, we'll have to return to Europe for Gorbachev's revolution that is going to end the Cold War. And moreover, there are all sorts of other important things that we'll have to consider with regard to Europe. And we will even be talking about Europe today, the Berlin crises of 1958 and 1961. So that generalization doesn't hold up there. And then the other aspect of it, it doesn't really properly appreciate. I mean, that is to say, that generalization about the Suez crisis as a benchmark in the history of the Cold War, that generalization does not take into account the whole world, I think. It's not a global generalization. It's a generalization about U.S.-Soviet relations, and I think it has to do with a fairly narrow frame of reference. But if we look at it from the standpoint of a kind of a global view, I think we can see that Suez represents 1956, kind of a really important benchmark. It's really the end of the British and French empires. The United States and the Soviet Union together, one way or another, have pulled the rug out from the British and the French and the Israelis on the Suez events. They have not permitted the overthrow of Nasser. So it looks as if those two empires, and those are considerable empires, as you see from this map that we have before us here, these are very formidable empires. The French have a lot of possessions all over Africa, and of course they're in process now of being driven out of Indochina, but they have plenty of African possessions. And the British, too, have very considerable possessions throughout Africa and throughout the rest of the world. But those empires are not going to be able to continue on the same basis. And if you look closely at these dates of independence that are indicated on this map for all of the countries of the third world, I mean, just about all the countries of the third world, you'll see that a lot of these dates are clustered around the period directly after the Suez crisis. That is to say, we see the Maghreb, Morocco, Tunisia, getting its independence about 1956. And then we see a bunch of others, Sudan, 56. And then something 57, 1960, Ghana, 58, So if you look at all these dates, you'll see that the Suez crisis is the main, how shall we put it, the main turning point in the fortunes of European colonialism, especially British and French colonialism, but we also have to take into consideration the fading out of the Belgians in the Congo. And later on, of course, we're going to have to talk quite a good deal about the Portuguese colonies, because you see them on the map here, Angola, Mozambique, and you can barely see the others, Guinea-Bissau, Sao Tome, Cape Verde Islands. These Portuguese colonies will not escape the grip of Portugal until 1974. So it's a rather drawn out story here. But it all begins with Suez, I would contend. And from this point on, I think we do have to focus in a more serious way about the third world. Now, what emerges in the Middle East as a result of the events in Suez? You remember that in 1956 there was a Baghdad Pact that was put together mainly by the British, but the United States, of course, participated in this thing. That it centers around Persia and Iraq, that is to say Iran and Iraq. Now, those are the two big oil producing regions, and that's the main material interest the British have in maintaining this pact, aside from, of course, general anti-communist motives. But they have a lot of oil in this area. And of course, the British are very heavily invested in Iraqi oil. So you could make the argument that Iraq is kind of the center of gravity of the Baghdad Pact since its inception in 1957. Well, how's that affected by Suez? The British don't seem to be able to hold up their end of the Baghdad Pact. At any rate, that one might question, independent observer might question the continued commitment of the British, the continued ability of the British to maintain the integrity of the Baghdad Pact, which would be the cornerstone of their security in the Middle East. And to be sure, suppose Nasserism takes hold. Well, these countries we're looking at here, the members of the Baghdad Pact, are not likely to be Nasserist because they're not Arab countries. But we have Iraq as an Arab country there, and so that is the one country that could have the possibility of a Nasserist temptation, if we can put it that way. That is to say, to go along with this increasing spirit of very truculent Arab nationalism as represented by Nasser, that is reaching out in every direction. And that is, for example, trying to help the Algerians to overthrow the French. That takes the position that all of the Arabs have to unite against Israel and all those other considerations. So Iraq counts in that way. Iraq is bound to be part of the, how do you put it, the radius of cultural pull or political pull that the Nasser idea exercises in the Middle East. So immediately after these events, the question started to come up whether the British are going to be able to hold their end up of this whole thing, especially since the United States has pulled the rug out from Britain in 1956. And the United States immediately announced what it began to call the Eisenhower Doctrine. So the Eisenhower Doctrine makes the argument that the main thing in the Middle East is communism, and that the communists are trying to penetrate, and that when you really look at Arab nationalism, it has its peculiarities, its particularities, and all the rest of that, but the main impact of it in world politics is that it serves or can serve to advance the cause of communism. That the communists can play ball with Arab nationals. They are encouraging Nasser. They defended Nasser in 1956, and so communism still really is the main thing in the Middle East. That's the Eisenhower Doctrine. In effect, one has to say, the Eisenhower Doctrine, in effect, is an attempt to organize politically and emotionally all the countries in the Middle East, and countries that were previously centering themselves around the Baghdad Pact and hope to continue to do so in the future, although that's questionable, center them around the idea of anti-communism. So to prevent Soviet penetration, that's what the Eisenhower Doctrine is all about. It's an attempt to organize the Middle East in terms of anti-communism. And right away, the Eisenhower Doctrine ran into trouble in 1958 when the government of Iraq, the Hashemite monarchy in Iraq, was overthrown by a coup by a general by the name of Qasem, and he had Nasserist sympathies and immediately started to make the argument that Iraq ought to form some kind of a natural connection to Nasserism and to Arab nationalism in general, and ought to renew the struggle against Israel. So this is an important thing, the loss of Iraq. And of course, now when you start to think of this in terms of oil, Iraq is an enormous oil producer, so the British are in big trouble to see Nuri Said, their client and prime minister of Iraq under the Hashemite monarchy, to see him overthrown. The British are very much worried about the oil possessions, their oil possessions in the Middle East generally, but centering on Iraq. This is a terrific blow for them. And the United States now making the argument that it's going to hold things up in terms of anti-communism, but that looks like the end of the Baghdad Pact once you see the Iraqis starting to make common cause with Nasser. Remember that Nasser and the Baghdad Pact, they represent opposite poles of attraction in Mideast politics. So the Syrians and the Egyptians, they want to have some kind of a union. In 1957, they proclaim that they're one country. That's not going to last. It'll go away in a couple of years, but at least in 1957, it looked rather formidable. And Yemen even made noises to the effect that it wanted to be part of this bloc. One Arab, one Arab voice centering on Egypt, and then on the other side, the Baghdad Pact. So that's the axis. That's the those are the two valences of opposition in Mideast politics. And the Qasem coup represents really a death blow to the Baghdad Pact. And I guess also you might say to British interests. It's no accident that within a year of this time, fear that this mood that has taken over Iraq, this Nasserist mood that has taken over Iraq, will penetrate further. And, Jordan is the first place that it appears likely to the West to be threatened to penetrate. So both the British and the United States got very upset about the Iraqi revolution, if you can call it that, of 1958, started to worry that Jordan would join them, and maybe even Lebanon would join them. And they got calls from the leadership in Jordan and Lebanon for some kind of outside Western support against Nasserism. So these governments are not exactly, as secure as they would like to be. Now, it's hard to judge the sensibility of the populations involved in all this when you see the actual change of perspectives, really a diplomatic revolution going on in this country or that in the Middle East. So it's difficult for us to judge, what's strong and what's weak, what the forces are that would lend themselves to the overthrow of a government. But we get a shortcut here by thinking about the army. Whatever the forces are. The ideas in the period, the revolutionary ideas that are sort of in the air in the Middle East, they penetrate into the armed forces. So military people, and big ones in every country, are thinking about these same things that we talk about when we talk about Nasserism and revolutionary politics, third world, etc., revolutionary politics. Immediately penetrates into the military. So that's what everybody's afraid of. That there's going to be a coup, and that's what the events in Iraq represented. Not a big popular revolution, but a military coup, which calls itself a revolution because it's overturning everything. What would we call this, by the way, talking about it in terms of Western history? We'd probably say Bonapartism, some kind of Napoleonic quality, I guess. Bonaparte, the ability of the armed forces to take a hand in politics and sometimes in a revolutionary way. So at any rate, the fear in the hearts, the minds of the British and the Americans immediately after the fall of Iraq to Nasserism, presumably, in 1958 was that they had to beef up other areas, had to keep Jordan from falling out of the pro-British camp. And Jordanian armed forces were trained by a man named Glub Pasha, up to this, a British officer, up to this point, and he's no longer around. The Jordanians have dismissed him, so that's a danger sign for the British. They're really worried about Jordan, losing Jordan. And similarly, Syria acting in such a way, such a friendly way to Iraq automatically suggests the idea that the Lebanese might, might go the same direction and might make a very solid anti-Israel front among all of these Arab nationalists. Now, they're not all Sunnis. There are a lot of Shias in Lebanon, but they're all Arabs. And so that's the problem. Arab nationalism and Nasserism. Nasserism is a good way for us to understand this whole complex of revolutionary energies and how they get summed up in an idea or a slogan or a personification or some kind of thought like that. So anyhow, the United States is very nervous about Jordan and about Lebanon, and so in 1958 they actually sent troops. So the British sent a battalion of troops to Jordan, and the U.S. Troops came ashore from carriers on the beaches, in Beirut. There they are. And so the sunbathers are all sitting there, eating their ice cream cones, and the American troops are going by. So these were two very sharp interventions in it. Looked for all the world for a while there that there would be some kind of general Mideastern war. But it turned out that the interventions by the United States, they were formidable enough. And they did stem the tide of the spread, if you will, of Nasserism. They did have that effect, at least for the moment. Not that the United States is going to be able to run anything in the Middle East. We shouldn't be under any illusions about that. Landing a few troops, not that it's going to have such a lasting impact, but at any rate, it did seem to create a certain amount of, how to put it, assuaging of fears. And I guess it's a psychological question as well, mostly with the British and with the Americans. But you could make the argument that this military intervention did stem the tide. That would be arguable, and the opposite would be too. But it would be arguable that it stemmed the tide of Nasserism, at least for the moment. But it didn't fix the Baghdad Pact. So the United States is going to have to work on fixing the Baghdad Pact from this point on. And eventually it will put together a similar arrangement. It'll look just like the Baghdad Pact, CENTO they'll call it. And we'll have CENTO once again filling in the space in the Middle East. And you go from Turkey to Pakistan, mostly non-Arab countries now in this pact. And it will play its role alongside NATO and Europe, CETO, as we know well. From 1954, CETO in the Far East. And so there's the structure of containment under the Eisenhower Dulles regime. It looks very much like the British Empire geopolitically. As you can see, it's in all roughly the same places. The rim lands in the world island around the heartland, and the Soviet Union and China representing the heartland. That's going to be the structure of the U.S. conception of containment vis-a-vis the Soviets from this point on. Although CENTO and CETO they're never going to be similar. They should not be compared, really, in any way. Should not be compared in terms of their actual strength, the actual threat they represent, or their actual substance to NATO, of course. And the center of gravity, or I should say the center stage in the revolutionary drama that we're also trying to trace through this thing. Remember, we've got the eruption of third world nationalism at the Bandung conference in 1955. And so that looks like it's going to be a big wave for the future. I'm going to be arguing that that is the big wave throughout the 60s. And you can perhaps look at the events that occur in the United States, the civil rights movement, student movement, all those other things, anti-Vietnam War movement. Maybe you can look at them in terms of this kind of conception of a third world, how to put it, a third world nationalism rising up all over the globe. So where's it going to center from this point on? It's going to be in Algeria. So Algeria now is kind of interesting. You remember that Algeria is probably the main reason why the French wanted to intervene against Nasser in 1956 in the first place. Nasser's been giving help to the guerrillas who are fighting in Algeria. You can follow a lot of this through a terrific Costa Gavras film called Battle of Algiers. Everybody in the 1960s saw this film and more or less interpreted everything about the Algerian War from what they saw in this very powerful film. For the French, I think this is the main thing. You remember, the French see Algeria as a colony, but they see it as part of France. And the saying, as I think I've said before, cited before, the saying in France is that just as the Seine separates Paris, the river Seine separates Paris, the Mediterranean Ocean separates France. So Algeria is French as far as the French are concerned, and they're not going to take the same view toward Algeria that they've taken towards, say, Morocco or Tunisia. Well, I think mainly because they really don't feel they can continue their influence in these countries in general, but they really got to center on Algeria from this point on. So for the French, that's the main thing. And the impact it's going to have for our purposes is that it's going to bring de Gaulle back to power. Remember, de Gaulle was against the Cold War, 44 to 47. He would have had an entirely different scheme in Europe. He's for hanging on to the British colonies. There's the paradox with de Gaulle. And that's his reputation still at this point, especially among the denizens of the French right, and especially people in the French military and officers who are serving in Algeria, who are going to end up to be opponents of de Gaulle. And really, they're going to be very scary types. And going to make a number of attempts at getting rid of de Gaulle, assassinating him, strictly speaking. So this is going to be an important thing in our estimation of how Gaullism shapes up. The idea that the Algerian crisis brought de Gaulle back to power, and de Gaulle is going to have a big impact on European politics in general. We'll have to talk about this at great length as we go on throughout the 1960s. So Algeria then is the center of everything. In Algeria, you have a very, very powerful popular movement for independence from France. It's hostile to France. You have a very, very powerful movement among French citizens and among people who benefit or who identify in some way with France, to hang on to France and to make it French. Algeria is French is their slogan, and de Gaulle is going to be the how to put it, the attempt at a solution to all of these questions. So here's de Gaulle marching in with his generals, de Lattre Tassigny on his left, who's been commanding forces unsuccessfully in Indochina, as you know by now. And so he's a military man dressed up in all his military garb here, reviewing troops and all the rest of that. He came back to power in 1953, bearing the promise, whether this was justified or not is another matter, but bearing the promise that he was going to figure out a way to hang on to Algeria one way or another. Certainly the French right and the military people who were ready to fight to the end over Algeria certainly they had every confidence that de Gaulle would save them. In the end, he's going to sponsor the transition of Algeria over into control by the Algerians. So he's going to negotiate an end to the empire. And he'll try to do it behind a broad program of creating a French community comparable to the British Commonwealth. That is to say, a series of nations that are no longer colonies, but are still somehow culturally and one hopes economically and politically connected to the mother colonial country. So the French are going to be able to pull this off to a very considerable degree. I'll talk more about who was with them and who wasn't with them, and that'll be of interest to our story, especially about how African politics figure in all of this. But at any rate, the return of de Gaulle also occasions the return, or I should say the strengthening, of a group to de Gaulle's right. So this cartoon more or less lays that out. Here are the people on the left of the screen to de Gaulle's right under the banner of ultras. That is to say, denizens of the far right, very, very keen to hold on to Algeria at all costs. And then on the left, the Algerian revolutionaries, Ben Bella, Boumediene, all the important figures in the revolutionary movement that's been going on for some time. They're on the other side. And so this cartoon indicates how de Gaulle's going to march in between these two forces that might be equally hostile to him as to each other. And it gives an indication of his predicament there. And here's a poster that was put up about organizing the resistance to any kind of any kind of caving in to Algerian nationalism on the part of the French citizens, and it puts everything in terms. I thought this was interesting in terms of the French Revolution. So it's a colonial idea, but it's in terms of the French Revolution. We got to hang on to Algeria at all costs, aux armes citoyens, to arms citizens. And then and this is a placard of the Organisation Armée Secrète, the organization of the secret army. The secret army. I hope we don't ever have secret armies in our country. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but the French did over this Algerian question. So these are army officers who really feel that they can't trust de Gaulle, and he's going to cave in to the Algerians, and they got to fight to the bitter end and all the rest of that. They're going to make attempts on his life, going to try to overthrow him several times. Last time in the spring of 1961. So what would you call this sort of stuff? It's a kind of, I don't know, maybe it's a sort of neo-fascism. At any rate, that certainly was argued about the leadership of the OAS, the Organization of the Secret Army, and General Salin, its most famous figure, under this little poster that says, "We'll win, we'll win." Salin is generally regarded in the United States by look at this, by Time as a terrorist. And they talk about three-way war in Algeria. So there's the Algerian revolutionaries, there's the OAS, and there's de Gaulle. So a three-way war going on in Algeria. Who's behind all of this stuff? Or how does this all happen? Who favors these people? Where do they have their headquarters? Most of the OAS figures, secret army figures on the extreme right, in France, enemies of Gaullism, on the extreme right, were organized in Franco's Spain. So Franco's Spain is, remember, it's still a fascist country, strictly speaking. War's over. They've never overthrown Franco. They've really never overthrown his regime. And it's a sort of a hospitable place. Is Spain during these years for ex-Nazis, ex-fascists, ex-people of the right generally, and especially this figure, Otto Scorsini. So Otto Scorsini is probably the most swashbuckling figure, the Errol Flynn of German Nazism, I think you have to say. There he is with his dueling scar and everything that goes with that. It was he who made that daring raid on the Italians when the royalist Italian government tried to put Mussolini into prison. So he raided the prison and freed Mussolini and extracted him, took him up to the north of Italy and set him up with a temporary regime, which was only overthrown when the war was completed. And there he is in his younger days, of course, there he is with Mussolini himself. So Otto Scorsini, interesting figure. He's written about by Martin Lee in a book called The Beast Reawakens, which I recommend to all of you who want to read about these. It's not exactly pleasant reading, but to read about these sects of people of the far right, fascists, the neo-fascism generally in Europe, the kind of people I think who Steve Bannon is trying to organize and teach in a kind of neo-fascist university in Italy at present. This is a pretty good book to read. It's a big book, and so it's got a lot of information about all their movement. Not many people have wanted to do the research to pay attention to all of these activities of all these little quirky groups, but it is European neo-fascism, and neo-fascism is a real phenomenon. So it's an important thing for us to remember when we consider the position of de Gaulle, because de Gaulle is going to be very important to us. All right, so that's the drama that's unfolding with regard to the Algerian Revolution. Bear in mind that's going to be complete by 1962. So Algeria will be fully independent after 1962, and it's going to turn into a kind of socialist state, I think you have to say. And nowadays, I think you'd have to say that Algeria probably has more property under public ownership than most states in the world. So it's still a very socialist kind of state. I don't know if it's a very radical state today. Maybe it isn't a radical state, but it's somewhat radical. Or at any rate, it certainly has a radical background. All right, so the Algerian events. We're going to come back to this. But let's leave them for a moment and consider the same period, the same things, and what happened to the Soviet Union in the wake of the events of 1956. Well, no, the Soviet Union has come out of 1956 in good odor, I think you have to say, in the third world. It looks good. The general opinion in the third world is that Nasser was saved because Khrushchev and Bulganin threatened Britain and France with some kind of nuclear weapons or anything. They warned them that some war might result in, watch out, we've got nuclear weapons. So in the rest of the world, there's a sense, certainly in the third world, there's a sense somehow that the Soviets have come out of this very strong, and they've forced the British and the French, at any rate, to back down. Now, what they've done vis-a-vis the United States, another story, but the United States is more or less on their side, in more or less a certainly separate position, but to the same effect against the British and the French in 1956. So all this looks very good for the prestige of the Soviet leadership, and for the Khrushchev leadership that's just come to power and just completed this struggle that Khrushchev has been waging against Mayankov. And there we have Khrushchev and Mayankov greeting people. There's Bulganin on the left. He's a military man, political officer, vis-a-vis the military. Political general is what you should call him. He's kind of like Schleicher was in the days of Weimar Germany. A political general. He's going to fade from the picture now. He's going to turn against Khrushchev. And Mayankov too. And they've got a case against Khrushchev. They can make the argument that maybe we shouldn't have put this character into power so quickly. Maybe he doesn't know what he's doing. And look at all the trouble we got because he's criticizing Stalin in the secret speech. And look at the trouble we had in Hungary and Poland immediately after his criticism of Stalin. Maybe he's playing footsie with Tito. This is not good leadership. Maybe Khrushchev ought to be replaced by new leaders. Here are the lesser leaders, people you might think were very important. So Mayankov on the left, Lazar Kaganovich on the right, So Kaganovich, an old Stalinist, not a really important leader at this point, but a substantial second-rank politician, I think, in the Soviet leadership. Mayankov, just previously a premier, so he's the person who's been degraded by the rise of Khrushchev. But the most important person in the whole thing was, where am I? I'm going backwards. Forgive me. But the most important thing in the whole criticism of Khrushchev in 1957 was Molotov. So Molotov, the shrewdest, the most experienced, the most canny, the most diplomatically astute of all of them, the best sense of world politics, and of course, very, very sincere, passionate revolutionary. I mean, he certainly doesn't look the part. But I don't know, what does the part look like? It's hard for us to understand that. Anyhow, these people all came up against Khrushchev in 1957 and tried to get rid of him. So they usually are called the Molotov group. The Soviet Union, once it had defeated them, or I should say Khrushchev, once he had defeated them, started to call them the anti-party group, and that's what we usually call them. In most of the literature, you see them referred to as the anti-party group. So this criticism came up very sharply in the spring of 1957. They wanted to get rid of Khrushchev, and they just about did it. They got a majority against him in the Politburo. So they had 7 votes to 4 against Khrushchev. Khrushchev should have left power. Now we can say something about the character of the Soviet political regime at this point, how it's changing. Remember that under Stalin, it's been a personal dictatorship, okay? Now, we can't say that about Khrushchev. We can't say that Khrushchev has the same kind of power that Stalin had. No, not at all. So what is going on? What institutions are becoming important now that the personal regime, or what Khrushchev calls the personality cult, is under criticism, and it's a thing of the past? What kind of regime do we have? Well, it's a kind of a bureaucratic dictatorship, you could say, run by the Politburo. Maybe, if that's true, they should have got rid of Khrushchev. So these are the main candidates who would have succeeded Khrushchev had this regime been a bureaucratic regime run by the Politburo. But it's not quite that. It's not quite that, because Khrushchev refused to put up with this vote against him. However, he was not able to arrest everybody who had risen up against him. Okay, right away we see big changes going on. We have to take note of these. Nobody bothers to do this, but it's worth doing. We have to take note of how the Soviet Union is changing throughout this course. So at any rate, Khrushchev should have stepped down at this point and left things to the Molotov group, as most people like to refer to it. I'm not sure exactly what they would have put together as a kind of leadership, but we have kind of a general idea of their policy. Would have been a little more pro-Chinese than Khrushchev was. Otherwise, I'm not sure they had any ideas about anything that they were going to be able to do that Khrushchev didn't have. But at any rate, they were trying to overthrow him. And Khrushchev said no, he wouldn't accept a Politburo vote against him. It had to go out to the full Central Committee, 309 members. So the Central Committee only meets infrequently, the Central Committee plenums. And you have to bring them in from all over the Soviet Union. So you got people from far-flung places that have to catch airplanes, fly into Moscow for this special meeting. So what's comparable to our Central Committee? I guess we don't have anything really comparable to that. Maybe 2%, 1% comparable to our Senate. Well, I don't know. Maybe that doesn't make sense. But at any rate, it's the Central Committee that would have to pass on the Politburo. So bear in mind now, the Politburo is not legitimate enough to be able to get its way. It has to submit itself to a vote of the Central Committee. And then the Central Committee, that's going to be a democratic vote. They're going to count the votes at any rate. And it's not even sure. I mean, I'm sure none of these people had any idea how all these members of the party would vote. about whether they would get rid of Khrushchev. So that's kind of an important point. But it's got some other things that are brand new, that are not Soviet at all, because these 309 members who had to get on planes, a lot of them, had to get on planes, and not all of them could catch the flights they wanted because they were all flying on military planes. And it turns out Khrushchev got Marshal Zhukov, who he had elevated to the Ministry of Defense. Remember this, Zhukov is the one that has pretty much put Khrushchev over the top with regard to Malenkov. So now Zhukov is going to deny flights to those members thought likely to vote against Khrushchev. No, this is a military coup in the party. That's interesting. It's interesting for our purposes. Lots of things. The military has no influence, zero, in the Soviet regime. I mean, occasionally you see some journalist who doesn't know anything referring to an old-fashioned military coup, Soviet style. I've seen it by people in New York Times who said, old-fashioned military, Soviet-style military coup. There is no Soviet style. There's never been any kind of a whisper of any kind of ability of the military to stand up to the party since 1917. I mean, the only moment it could have happened, maybe, was when Trotsky stepped down as Commissar of War in 1925. But Trotsky didn't even think of it. It's not part of his mental universe to appeal to the army to make a coup in the party. But that happened in 1956. So Zhukov made this coup. Oh, well, at any rate, I get to the point. I have to get to the point eventually. The Central Committee reversed the decision of the Politburo and put Khrushchev right back in power. The Molotov group was denounced. They called them the anti-party group. They all lost their jobs. They didn't shoot them, though. They didn't shoot them. They didn't put them on trial or any of that business. They didn't disgrace them. Well, they criticized them, but they didn't disgrace them. And so they were dismissed from their posts. And Molotov is still going to have a say in the party, although they're going to kick him out of the party eventually. But he's not going to be arrested or anything like that. It's not the Stalin regime anymore. It's really changed in a big way. Moreover, even Zhukov didn't benefit from this. And it happened, I think, for the most part because the grouping that eventually formed around Khrushchev as a result of this intervention made by Zhukov in the military on Khrushchev's behalf, that these people eventually decided they didn't want a military dictatorship either. So that's another step in the evolution, you could argue, of the Soviet regime. Not easily recognized, of course, but we have to use special historical criteria to recognize this. At any rate, these are the leadership. This is the leadership immediately after the defeat of the anti-party group in 1957. So Dmitry Shalyepin on the left, and to Khrushchev's left, Leonid Brezhnev, who is going to succeed Khrushchev. And then on the far right of the picture, Mikhail Suslov, the most important person, I would say, in the party at this point. I mean, maybe even more important than Khrushchev himself. I think so. Very, very important. And Suslov stands for the idea of collective leadership. We don't want another Stalin. Collective leadership in the party. You could argue this is a Leninist norm, to use their language. A Leninist norm, collective leadership. They never had personal dictatorship under Lenin. Anybody who says that is blowing smoke. It's not right. Collective leadership. Khrushchev can be first among equals, but they're equals. And who's going to make sure that that system is, how to put it, protected and fortified? Suslov. And what's his field exactly? Agriculture? Is it military? No, his field is ideology. Isn't that interesting? Ideology. This is a regime with an ideological animus at its very heart and soul. The core of its being is the Marxist-Leninist so-called ideology. And the person who is considered the best Marxist in the party is Suslov. After all, that's his specialty. It's all he does. Moreover, Suslov is an unusual figure because he didn't write anything. So you try to argue, what does Suslov think? You have to piece it together from quotations, something he may have said at a reception or something like that. He never writes anything, so you can't read Suslov articles and books and that sort of thing, get an idea what sort of ideology the regime is marching under, but you know whatever it's marching under, it's Suslov who is interpreting it, who's telling everybody, oh, this is not Marxist. Oops, can't do that, or should do this. So Suslov, very important figure, often overlooked in discussions of history of the Soviet Union. We're not going to overlook him because he's going to be very important for us. We're going to overthrow his boss, Khrushchev, in 1964. We'll have to talk about that, how that figures in the relationship with China and all those related things. At the end of this thing, Suslov and the others got together and they said, hey, we don't like the military being able to intervene in central committee affairs like Zhukov did on behalf of Khrushchev. Let's get rid of Zhukov. Well, not get rid of him. I did not shoot him or anything like that. But get him out of the Ministry of Defense. Put somebody in there who's more reliable from the standpoint of the party, who's not going to intervene in the party. So there he is, Rodion Malinovsky. He's the man who comes to the Ministry of Defense in succession to Zhukov, and Zhukov was retired after having performed the service. So you could say that Khrushchev rose on account of Zhukov, but now Zhukov's gone. So Khrushchev is going to fall. Not right away, but he's going to fall when it appears he's not doing a good job in the leadership. That's about the only way they have of changing the leadership. They don't have elections. They don't have alternates. They don't have a constitutional framework to determine these things. I hope the United States can say that it does have these things, which are very much in question nowadays, as you know. But the Soviets don't have these things. And so everything we're talking about has to be discussed in terms of some kind of institutional precedent that it is setting for a new kind of system. So we have to keep thinking about these things as we approach the Gorbachev events that are going to destroy the Soviet leadership altogether. Okay, Khrushchev then emerges from the struggle with the anti-party group on top in the leadership. What's his relationship with Mao? Mao supports him. Mao supports him. Mao endorses Khrushchev. It's absolute bunk that Mao and Khrushchev fell out over the secret speech, over the criticism of Stalin. You often see that. You often see people saying that. Not so. That's not right. Mao endorsed him at the meeting of the 64 communist parties in November 1957. Mao made a big speech, says there's got to be one center of the communist movement, and that center is the Soviet Union. Those who argue that the Khrushchev line is not correct are in error and should not be listened to. So definite support for Khrushchev. Moreover, Mao says in that thing, he says, we're approaching a point where it looks as if our idea is emerging as triumphant in the world. Triumphant in the world. The east wind, he says, is prevailing over the west wind. Let me quote now from his speech to the meeting, November 18th, 1957, the speech at the meeting of the 64 communist parties in Moscow. He says, it's my opinion that the international situation has now reached a new turning point. There are two winds in the world today, the east wind and the west wind. There's a Chinese saying, either the east wind prevails over the west wind, or the west wind prevails over the east wind. I have no idea if this is really a Chinese saying, but let's go along with now. It's characteristic of the situation today, I believe, that the east wind is prevailing over the west wind. That is to say, forces of socialism are overwhelmingly superior to the forces of imperialism. And then he goes into all of the history of this great struggle between socialism and imperialism, which goes back to the revolution, talks about the key events, and Stalingrad, he says, that's a key moment when Hitler was defeated for the first time, or at any rate, defeated decisively, we should say. That was a big moment, and we're at one of those moments right now. Interesting. So that's the basis, if you will, the ideological, world historical basis as revolutionaries, the basis of the union between Mao and Khrushchev, that the east wind is prevailing over the west wind, that communism, and defining communism and socialism as something from the east. That's interesting too. I wonder if everybody will go along with this idea. But at any rate, there they are, sitting at a table together with Ho Chi Minh and with an interpreter. And they met on various occasions. Khrushchev tells us all about the meetings and says a lot of things about Mao, things that we ought to take with a grain of salt, not knowing enough about Mao. We have to read more of Mao's actual statements, and rather than just taking Khrushchev's word for it, because not everything is quite accurate. Why are they saying this? Well, it's because of Sputnik. Because it was in 1957 that the Soviets demonstrated that they could put a satellite into space orbit. You have to even define for people in that period what a space orbit is. At a certain point, the attraction between the two bodies, the satellite and the Earth, and the tendency, as Descartes said in the 17th century, of a body in motion to stay in motion in a straight line. Those two tendencies are balanced out and you get an orbit. That all had to be described. What on earth is a satellite? That had to be told. We had to be educated about that. The Earth satellite actually going around the Earth. Well, if they had a rocket that was capable of putting a satellite into orbit, it certainly was capable of hitting the United States with a nuclear warhead. So that's the first time the Soviets really appeared as a country that could destroy the United States with missiles. Now, up to this time, they do have missiles, and those were intermediate range ballistic missiles, 2,000-3,000 mile range, that they threatened the British and the French with at Suez in 1956. Those are intermediate range weapons. You can't hit the United States with those things. You couldn't hit the United States with those things. But this is different. This is an Icbm, an intercontinental ballistics missile. And Sputnik demonstrates the Soviets have got one and the United States does not. The United States did not have such a thing. So if I talk about the panic about Sputnik, you can understand why there's a panic. They've got one of these things and we don't. Not saying we can't destroy them. We got bases close to the Soviet Union, can destroy them with IRBMs and of course with Strategic Air Command, with bombers. But the Soviet Union has never had anything comparable to that to threaten the United States with. The threat to the United States has always been kind of abstract. The Tupolev 4 bomber, they said it had an intercontinental range, they said, the Tupolev bomber can deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States and then ditch in Mexico. Khrushchev tells us in his memoirs, I don't believe this, but it's a funny story. Khrushchev tells us in his memoirs that when this was brought up, Stalin brought this up, we could hit the United States with a nuclear weapon, with a long-range bomber, and ditch in Mexico. That Khrushchev, answered by saying, what do you think, Mexico is our mother-in-law? We can just stop by for Sunday dinner with her whenever we feel like it. That would have been a very funny line if he ever actually did say that. I don't believe for a minute. I don't believe this story for a minute, but it makes a good story. It's Khrushchev all over, strictly speaking. Okay, so Sputnik. So there's what Sputnik demonstrates as space age is. Here, Russia has won the outer race, the space race. Now, when they talk about space race, there's one thing to say, oh, it's a race for putting up satellites. It's a race for walking on the moon or things like that. But it's mainly a race to build rockets that are capable of hitting the other side with nuclear weapons. So that's very, very big point in all of that lies behind all of this other talk about Sputnik. And so you see these depictions of Sputnik and Khrushchev, the king of the world, wearing the Kremlin crown on his head, holding Sputnik in his hands. And there's the Soviet posters that say the path opens, period, forward. The path is opening, science. And who's the master of this, by the way? The Soviets are the master. All over the third world, the idea is starting to sink in that not only have they got the upper hand, maybe the east wind is prevailing over the west wind, Suez and all that, but maybe the Soviet system, planned economy, socialism, all the rest of that is inherently superior to capitalism in the organization of national resources and in the promotion of science and technology. That's a very pregnant implication of Sputnik for the third world. And what's the U.S. answer? In 1958, the United States started what you might call the IRBM strategy as an answer. Started stationing intermediate range weapons. So there are weapons here with 1,500 mile to 2,000 mile capability, and stationed them in Turkey, Italy, and in Britain. So here's a one indicating the fan that encompasses targets in the Soviet Union to be hit from the missile site in Turkey. So that's quite a threat. I mean, we think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Gee, they would have been able to hit Chicago, to hit various points in the United States. This is the same thing vis-a-vis Russia. So IRBMs then that can hit Russian targets as a response to Sputnik. And there are the ranges of the Jupiter missiles, IRBMs in Turkey and Italy, and the Thors, same kind of weapon, intermediate range. These are not ICBMs, they're less, but look how close they are. So they can, in effect, do the same thing. And those were put into place. So these are new threats. Remember, the United States, when someone steals a march on it, often it can't think of anything else to do but to build a new weapon system or to deploy an old weapon system to some place it hasn't deployed it so far. And so there's the point. Matadors, intermediate range weapons, missiles of the same type as the Thor and Jupiter, put on Taiwan in order to attack Chinese targets. So they threatened Chinese as well. Mao's going to make a speech like that in '57, and this is going to be the answer that the United States makes to him. And these things are they're not invulnerable, these intermediate range weapons. You have to station them on an air base or someplace, right out in the open, and they can't be protected in any way. I mean, you can't put them in a silo or put them on a rail car or put them in the air so that they're hard to hit. No, they're easy to hit. That's the whole thing with them. The threat that they represent is a very, very vulnerable threat. That is to say, the weapon is very vulnerable. So, in effect, the vulnerability of these things is such that since they could be knocked out by a surprise attack, they would have to be launched on warning of a surprise attack. Launch on warning. Oh, so that means we're entering a very, how to put it, hair trigger phase of the arms race with these highly vulnerable and highly aggressive and highly threatening weapons, these IRBMs. There's a picture of the Matador. These are other Matadors. Chinese, of course, very, very excited about the Matadors that were stationed on Taiwan. And they really didn't feel that they should take this lying down. Should not indicate any fear of the imperialists. Have to do something very aggressive. Well, I'm pressing the wrong buttons here. So the Chinese decided to take under fire these outposts of the Kuomintang. Quemoy and Matsu, they're called. So there are two islands there. Look how close they are to China. They're really nowhere near Taiwan, but yet they're Taiwanese territories. The Taiwanese lay claim to them. And Taiwanese have got a lot of troops on both these islands. But for goodness sake, they're so easy for the Chinese, even with their rather primitive military capability, so easy for the Chinese to hit. They can hit them with ordinary artillery. And that's what they do. And they have a lot of fun with this, a lot of fun, because it really inflicts damage, humiliation, all the rest of that on Taiwan, demonstrates the impotence of Taiwan to do anything about it. Mao said there's like a sore toe. We like to step on this sore toe every once in a while. Quemoy and Matsu. So they can do this. And by the way, if Taiwan can't do anything about it, how about the United States? Can the United States do anything about it? It really puts the United States on the spot as well. What is the United States going to do to defend its friend, Taiwan, against the Chinese? Are we going to defend Quemoy and Matsu? The presidential election in 1960 between the first presidential debate, I think it was the first one, between Nixon and Jack Kennedy, revolved around this issue. I think it was the only foreign policy issue that they disagreed on, and only on nuances about how they would defend Quemoy and Matsu. What a question. How would the United States defend Quemoy and Matsu from Red China? That was the issue. So Chinese are in a position, therefore, to really put the heat on. Now, that puts the heat on the United States. It embarrasses the United States. It embarrasses Taiwan. It does all those things. But it also has the effect on Khrushchev of saying, gee, Mao thinks that the east wind is prevailing over the west wind, and we, that is to say, China and the US, can do anything that we want vis-a-vis the United States. And moreover, if the Chinese feel that they can challenge the United States in such a way, it's the Soviet Union that's got to back them up. They might throw the first pebble in a nuclear war. Do we Soviets want to give them a blank check on this? I've used the phrase, Germany gave Austria a blank check in 1914. Do whatever you like, we'll back you up. Ooh, don't want to give blank checks to people. I'm not saying it isn't done, but it's generally a very bad idea. Blank check. So now the whole Quemoy crisis starts to weigh on Khrushchev, starts to worry Khrushchev, and he said so, frankly, in his memoirs. Well, at the same time, these developments were unfolding. We were getting a fundamental criticism of the whole idea of massive retaliation. Well, maybe I should talk about this as maybe the last thing we talk about, and discuss these other questions, Cuban Revolution, and the Berlin crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, and things of that sort for the next period, and finish up with this discussion that went on in the upper reaches of the American leadership about what to do about it, the national security strategy under which the United States have been marching since Eisenhower and Dulles took power in 1952. We could put that under the heading of massive retaliation, I think. Remember that massive retaliation idea is if the communists threaten us even in a small way, we might respond in a big way. That's the idea of it. Asymmetrical response. A response that's out of proportion. So they might do something very small, like coming across the Korean border. They shouldn't count on us fighting them in Korea. They should wonder whether we're not going to answer that by dropping atomic bombs on the Kremlin. We're not saying we won't. This is more or less the way Dulles spoke of massive retaliation. So that's the rubric of American national security strategy. We're going to defend containment geopolitically by the threat of massive retaliation, even though we're going to cut the defense budget. We're going to cut the defense budget. We're going to concentrate on nuclear weapons. Not going to fight the communists anywhere in the world the way we did in Korea. That turned out to be a bad idea. Or we're going to fight them the way we did in Berlin in 1948. We had a big crisis and we openly kicked around the idea that we might have some kind of nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. Eventually they backed down. That's the conception of massive retaliation. Does it make sense when the United States has got a lead in nuclear weapons over the other side, when it's superior? Well, it certainly was in 1948, wasn't it? We had them and the other side didn't. Does that make as much sense when both sides have got them? Maybe when one side has ballistic missiles and the other side doesn't. Or, maybe they're just equality. That makes sense? No. I mean, I guess it wouldn't make terrific sense even under conditions of superiority, but it makes even less sense if you don't have superiority. So it's no accident that most of the responsible leaders in the United States started to say, we need a review of this whole Dulles idea of massive retaliation under conditions of Sputnik. Sputnik introduces something new to the equation. We can't always think about brinkmanship. We're going to, go to the brink, scare the hell out of the other side, and step back from the brink and always come up a winner. No. And so Dullesism, if you want to think of it that way, started to get a terrific attack by the leading elements in the United States leadership. So it's really going out of style fast. Sputnik was making this whole massive retaliation outlook look really absurd. So a lot of important people gathered in some blue ribbon committees. The most important, the Gaither Committee and the Rockefeller Committee. There's Nelson Rockefeller, the handsome, ebullient, brilliant fellow, natural politician, presumed president someday. And he has that in mind as well. And there he is with his favorite academic advisor, Henry Kissinger from Harvard, political science professor who calls himself a historian, not a historian, political science professor, a brilliant author of articles that appear in Foreign Affairs. You can go back and read them now. They're quite brilliant. But what are they brilliant at? They're brilliant at crises and how to negotiate with the other side over nuclear weapons, arms control, threats, perceptions of threats, that sort of thing. Not over anything specific, no geopolitical ideas at all. He uses that word, geopolitical, but he never writes in those terms, and to the same extent that he writes about nuclear strategy, how to use nuclear weapons. And of course, his famous book, his first big book, is Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. That title says it all about Kissingerism. So Kissinger advertises himself as the one who understands how you can use nuclear weapons in foreign policy, how you can employ threats, nuclear diplomacy, etc. He's very close to Nelson Rockefeller. If Nelson Rockefeller becomes president, he will be the national security advisor for sure, or Secretary of State, something like that. And of course, he got there anyhow under Nixon, but and that was because of Rockefeller. But here they are with their wives. Rockefeller's got his arm around his wife, Happy, and At the end of the picture is Nancy McGinnis, Rockefeller's secretary, who was Kissinger's wife. So there they are at a reception. So the United States is now reconsidering massive retaliation. And instead of massive retaliation, it's going to start to argue in terms of what it calls flexible response. Oh, so if the Soviets make some incursion against us, we're going to respond flexibly. Okay, that's a lot different from massive retaliation. Does that indicate weakness? Therein lies a big debate. We can't continue with that debate today. We'll talk about that continuing debate as we go on. The other thing that's involved in these blue ribbon committees, the Gaither and Rockefeller committees, is the idea that the Soviets got to Sputnik first, so it figures they're going to have more nuclear weapons in the future, more rockets at any rate in the future. It only figures. And the assumption, I think, that almost everybody, 98% of the people who write on this topic for the prestigious periodicals of the period, the assumption in their minds is that between 1960 and 1964, this is where people writing in 1958, for example, or 59, between 1960 and 1964, there's going to be a considerable missile gap between the United States and Soviet. The Soviets will have more and better missiles. Doesn't mean that there's a deterrence gap. The United States has SAC. The United States has all these IRBMs. So it's not a deterrence gap. It's a missile gap. But these missiles would probably be the first things you would use in a nuclear war. God forbid. God forbid. So there's a certain psychological electricity behind this idea of a missile gap, and it figures politically. People out of power, Jack Kennedy, can say to the people in power, in this case Richard Nixon in 1960, that you guys have permitted a missile gap and you're responsible for this. That's a fact. It's not wrong. And anybody who makes the argument, which is commonly made today, that this was all made up by Jack Kennedy in 1968 and wasn't on the level, that's not right. Everybody believed in the missile gap in those days. It's not, and it was not something you could say never existed. Sure, it existed from the minute Sputnik went up, and there was no American Sputnik. There was a missile gap of some sort. No, estimating over what it would be, and it's not going to be as great as that estimation. But who knew when these blue ribbon panels met and contemplated the matter in 1958? Who knew that? Everybody believed that there was going to be a missile gap. Okay, so this is a lot of hotting up about world affairs in terms of nuclear weapons, isn't it? ICBMs and IRBMs and missile gaps and all kinds of threats of it. How does this figure on the defense of Europe, and how does Germany figure in all of this? There arose a tremendous feeling in these days that the Germans might actually be given nuclear weapons. As the United States was passing them out and stationing them all over Europe, they might station a lot of nuclear weapons in Germany, which they were eventually going to do that, but might give the Germans nuclear weapons, give them access to nuclear weapons, give them matadors and nuclear warheads, something like that. And there's a lot of German press to that effect in those days. And frequently it was estimated that Konrad Adenauer, who headed the German government in those days, was lobbying heavily with President Eisenhower for some kind of German nuclear capability to be provided for by Eisenhower. This had been promised by Khrushchev to Mao in 1957. Khrushchev said, we did everything for Mao, we gave him technical experts, we sent them equipment, we were even building a bomb prototype, a model bomb for them to show them how to build nuclear weapons. So they promised to do that in 57, And then they decided in 59 that they were not going to do it. Why did they do that? Well, we don't know for sure. We have only speculations, interesting ones, but they are just speculations. And especially the American academic Walter D. Clements. He made the argument that there was some kind of a deal that Eisenhower and Khrushchev, maybe when they met in 1959, maybe they had a conversation where they said, look, let's not give nuclear weapons to the Germans or the Chinese. If you agree, Ike, not to give them to Adenauer, I'll agree, says Khrushchev, maybe, not to give them to Mao. Well, we don't know. We don't know if there was a deal. It's one of the most interesting thoughts in this whole course, but I haven't got a proper answer to it. At any rate, I can't lay out all the documents showing this agreement, this deal. But maybe there was. We can't say maybe it wasn't as good as a deal because that's what happened. The United States did not give nuclear weapons to Germany, as the Soviets feared. Khrushchev did not give nuclear weapons to China, as the United States feared. Those things did not happen. The dog in the middle of the night did not bark. Those things did not happen. So that's kind of interesting for us. Does that indicate that the United States and Soviet Union have a basis for cooperation on strategic affairs? Maybe. Does it indicate that the Chinese are going to be on good terms with Khrushchev and with the Soviets from this point on? No. If we're looking for the split between the two of them, we can practically measure it. And certainly from documents that have been issued by the Chinese, their version of the thing from this point. Because the Chinese who say that there was a deal about it, just as I've described. Don't give them to Germany, and the Russians won't give them to China. That's the way the Chinese tell the story, or did tell the story later on in the 60s. So those are all going to be very interesting, powerful, explosive, really, facts of life in the new international environment of the 1960s. The next thing I was going to talk about was the geopolitical side of this thing, which has to do with the decolonization of Africa and all kinds of movements and politics and things like that. That's all fascinating stuff, but we haven't got enough time for that today, and we have to break things off. So I'll have to bid you goodbye and take it up on another occasion. So next time we come to this, I'm going to talk about the decolonization of Africa, African nationalism, Martin Luther King, American black people's fight against Jim Crow, Cuban Revolution, climax of the whole thing, the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and finally Jack Kennedy's American University speech of 1963 promising a world made safe for diversity, which we never did get. Okay, so those are things for next time, and we'll take them up in due course.